The Savages, the 9th serial of Doctor Who's 3rd season, first broadcast in 4 parts from the 28th of May to the 18th of June 1966. Now this story remains completely missing from the BBC archives, or at least the original version of it does. However, in 2025 it became the latest classic Doctor Who story to be reanimated and released to the public. This was also the exit story for Peter Purvis's Stephen Taylor, as the end of this story would see him depart the TARDIS, but I'll get into that. Now, quick thing I just want to comment on before I start the story of this review is the animation. I said with my review of the Celestial Toymaker last year that while I felt the 3D animation style worked for that particular story, I hoped it wouldn't become the standard, because while it helped kind of maintain the idea that we were in another dimension and the Toymaker's realm was distinctly different, I felt if this became the standard 3D animation for all the animated stories, animated recreations, it would be a little bit distracting. Well, they went back to 2D animation style here, and I do think it does help the story for the better. It does work out better for that. As I said, the 3D worked for the Celestial Toymaker, but I'm glad they went back to 2D. Anyway, in this particular story, the First Doctor, played by William Hartnell, and his companion, Stephen Taylor, played by Peter Purvis, and Dodo Chaplet, played by Jackie Lane, land on a mysterious planet in the far future. There, they encounter 2 kind of warring tribes. There's the Elders, and then there's also the kind of wild savage people, the Savages, go out in the Farlands. Now, the Elders, they've managed to build this city, and it appears to be a beautiful city with everything they need, but then it does also seem to be slightly oppressive. Like, when Stephen and Dodo are being led around the city by 2 of the members there, Avon, played by Robert Sidaway, and Flower, played by Kay Patrick, Dodo asks if they ever go outside the city, and why would we ever want to leave? We have everything we need right here. That's something that you see quite a bit in kind of old sci-fi. Like, they build these perfect cities that no one would ever want to leave, and that ends up becoming a bit restrictive. Not necessarily for the writers, but just for the characters in the story. That if in the far future we don't actually want to go anywhere, then that does seem rather restrictive to us. But anyway, the Elders are led by a man named Jano, the Elder leader, played by Frederick Yeager, and he says that they've been expecting the Doctor for some time. So ends up kind of showing him the city and all around it. As I said, they encounter more characters like Jano, the Elder leader, played by Frederick Yeager. There's Captain Edel and Exhaust, 2 of the guards, played by Peter Thomas and Geoffrey Frederick. And as I said, Avon and Flower. But then also they end up meeting the Savages later on, and the main Savages who they encounter are the Savage leaders Chal, played by Ewan Solon, Tor, played by Patrick Godfrey, and Nanina, a young girl played by Claire Jenkins. What they ultimately end up discovering is that the Elders are using the Savages for their own ends. Basically, every so often they'll kidnap a Savage from the Savage Lands, bring them into the city, and then drain them of their life force. Not entirely, they don't kill them, but basically leave them severely weakened, and then they can use that life force to basically extend the lives and the minds of the Elders. And the Doctor is absolutely horrified by this, and ultimately plans to put a stop to it, leading Jano to effectively drain him as well, which does lead to quite a cool twist come Part 3 and Part 4. Doctor ends up getting drained at the end of Part 2, to which Stephen and Dodo end up finding him, having to lead him out to the Savage Lands of the caves for him to recover and use the medication there, but it does end up having an effect on Jano, as once Jano kind of absorbs Doctor's life force, he ends up with something he'd never expected, a conscience. Basically, his conscience makes him see the way they've been treating the Savages and ultimately makes him change his mind on things, which I do think is kind of a nice twist to this. I'll admit one element of the story I didn't particularly like was early on Stephen's attitude towards Dodo. Like when Dodo is kind of trying to question Avon and Flower as to exactly what's going on and why they're like this, and Stephen just seems kind of very dismissive of it. It's like, oh, you're imagining things, you're being dramatic. It's like, screw you, Stephen. Now, apparently, there was somewhat a plan to bring Peter Bowes back as Stephen Taylor for the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who in 2023. I'm kind of glad they didn't go through with it, because the way they planned to bring him back was quite weird. Like, I don't know if it was part of the toy maker's plans or something, but he would have been brought back as a cow. Apparently this idea was dropped as it would have been seen as overly parody, and I'm kind of glad for that. But I am also glad here that Stephen kind of got a proper exit story. Peter Purves kind of got a good exit story of Stephen, because one of the complaints I did have about the following story to this, the War Games, I think you can find it somewhere on one of these two sides, was that Dodo didn't really get an exit. Like, in the following story, the War Games, she kind of falls ill following a hypnotic experience with the War Machines, and then towards the end of the story, Ben and Polly just show up delivering the Doctor a message saying that Dodo has decided to remain behind. It's just like, it's not very much of anything. She doesn't really get a goodbye scene with the Doctor. Whereas Stephen here does get one fully, and I think it does fit him quite well. Come the end of the story, the Doctor, Stephen, Dodo, and the Savages, and even Jano, begin smashing up the Elders' machinery that they'd used to drain the Savages. And ultimately, the Elders and the Savages agree that they have much to rebuild with their societies and with their city. To which they kind of ask the Doctor if he can remain behind as a mediator to mediate sides between the Elders and the Savages. That way they can come to good agreements. The Doctor says, while it's a good idea, it's unfortunately completely impossible, because he can't really remain around. However, he does nominate Stephen to remain behind. And while Stephen is a little hesitant, not wanting to leave the Doctor and Dodo, he ultimately agrees to stay behind, and he does get a hug scene with Dodo, which I do think is kind of nice. Ultimately, I can't say this story is the greatest ever or the most thrilling, but it is nice to see a good Doctor Who story, and it's a decent exit story for Stephen. Could it have been grander? Maybe, but overall, I thought this was a pretty good story. Anyway, once again, that's technically it for now. What will be the next animated story? I've no idea. I am kind of holding out hope that maybe one day we'll get to see an animated recreation of the Wheel in space. Purely because that was the introduction of Wendy Padbury's Zoe, and also I'm a bit of a sucker for a Cyberman story. But what will be the next Doctor Who story that they reanimate? Can't tell at this point. We'll have to wait and see. Anyway, until next time, see ya.